Operations in the North Sea have finally reached the heart of the U-864, and the findings are a total game-changer for everyone involved. What most people don't realize is that this submarine was carrying a load so toxic it could ruin the entire coastline of Norway. Scientists finally opened the area around the wreck and realized the containment isn't holding up like they hoped. It's not that simple though, because moving this wreck might actually make things worse. Basically, we are looking at 67 tons of mercury that are slowly dissolving into the deep sea. Poison under waves. Scientists finally opened the investigation into the U-864 wreck, and the truth is that the situation is much worse than reported. This vessel has been sitting at the bottom of the North Sea for nearly 80 years, but only now are we truly understanding the scale of the danger. For starters, the submarine is not just a single piece of metal. It is split into two massive sections, with the bow and the stern lying about 130 feet apart. This gap has allowed the ocean currents to tear into the hull for decades. Inside that hull sits the most dangerous cargo ever sent into the deep. We are talking about 67 tons of metallic mercury packed into 1,857 steel flasks. This was part of a secret mission called Operation Caesar, which was supposed to bring high-tech equipment and raw materials to Japan. But here's the catch. Those steel flasks were never meant to last 80 years underwater. They are rusting through, and the poison is starting to pour out into the mud. What most people don't realize is that mercury is one of the most toxic substances on Earth. It doesn't just sit there, it moves. Scientists from the Norwegian Coastal Administration and the Norwegian Institute for Water Research have been monitoring the site, and their latest findings are a huge wake-up call. They estimate that between 8.8 and 22 pounds of mercury are escaping into the water every single year. That might not sound like a lot when you think about 67 tons, but mercury doesn't need much to cause a disaster. It creates a toxic zone in the sediment where levels are as high as 24,000 milligrams per kilogram. To give you some perspective, the normal background level in the ocean is usually around 0.02. That means the soil around the wreck is over 1 million times more toxic than it should be. And that is putting it lightly. The crazy part is that the mercury is already starting to affect the local wildlife. Crabs and fish near the wreck are showing signs of mercury uptake. While it hasn't completely ruined the entire food web yet, the potential is there. If the seabed shifts or if the hull collapses further, we could see a massive release that would end fishing in the region for generations. Scientists are worried that the slope where the sub sits is unstable. If that slope fails, it could bury the wreck or break the remaining flasks all at once. Basically, we are looking at an underwater volcano of poison that could erupt at any moment. This is a key detail that many early reports downplayed. They thought the mercury would stay in the flasks, but the salt water has proven to be a much more aggressive enemy than anyone expected. It is not just about the history of the war anymore. It is about an environmental catastrophe that is happening in real time. Everyone is obsessed with what else might be inside, like secret jet engines or advanced fuses, but the mercury is the real horror that scientists found when they opened the site for scanning. The corrosion is much deeper than they thought, and the stability of the wreck is a major concern. There are still many rumors in the air about what else could be down there, but what many can confirm is that the mercury is the biggest threat. See, it is not just sitting in the hold, it is soaking into the very earth beneath the ship. This makes cleaning it up nearly impossible. If they try to lift the wreck, they might break the flasks. If they leave it, it keeps leaking. It is a lose-lose situation that has been debated for years. But now, with the latest data, the government is being forced to make a choice. The cost of doing nothing is starting to look much higher than the $32 million it would take to try and fix it. Something else was lurking in the depths of the submarine that history almost forgot. Deadly hide and seek. Nobody expected this to happen, but the end of U-864 was the result of the most incredible underwater battle in history. It was February 9th, 1945, and the war was nearly over. The German submarine was trying to make a run for Japan, carrying its deadly cargo and top-secret plans. But the British had broken the German codes. They knew exactly where the sub was going. The U-864, a British submarine, was sent to intercept it. This led to the only time in history that one submerged submarine intentionally sank another submerged submarine. It was a deadly game of hide-and-seek played out in total darkness under the waves. The British crew had to track the sound of the German engines, moving slowly and quietly to avoid being seen. It was a high-stakes mission where one wrong move meant certain doom. The crazy part is that the Germans knew they were being followed. The captain of U-864 started zigzagging to throw off the British torpedoes. It was a brilliant move, but the British captain was even smarter. He calculated the Germans' movements and fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at different depths and angles. One of those torpedoes found its mark. The explosion was massive, and the U-boat didn't stand a chance. It snapped in half and plummeted 492 feet to the bottom of the sea. All 73 men on board were lost instantly. The sea claimed the ship, the crew, and the 67 tons of mercury. For decades, the wreck sat there in the dark, forgotten by the world until a local fisherman found it in 2003. But here's the catch. The sinking was just the beginning of the problem. When the sub hit the bottom, it didn't just stay in one piece.
Each part went its own way.
Absolutely.
Yes. And I can't understand at the moment that we shall find the bow in a distance to the aft of about 40 meters.
The force of the explosion and the impact with the seabed scattered the cargo and the debris over a huge area. This made the recent scientific opening of the wreck even more complicated. They found that the mercury flasks were scattered everywhere. Some were still inside the hull, but others were buried in the mud or lying on the open sand. This discovery changed everything. It meant that the safe burial of the ship wasn't an option. The poison was already out of the bag. The British victory in 1945 was a tactical masterpiece, but it created a long-term environmental disaster that we are still fighting today. What most people don't realize is how difficult it is to work at those depths. The pressure is immense, and the water is freezing. Sending divers down is too dangerous, so scientists have to use remotely operated vehicles to see what is happening. When these robots finally opened the view into the broken sections of the ship, they saw the true extent of the decay. The steel is paper-thin in some places. The wooden crates that once held aircraft parts are long gone, leaving only the heavy metal components behind. It is a ghost ship in every sense of the word. It's not that simple, though, because even though the sub is a grave, the living world around it is being poisoned by its presence. The heroic story of the U-864 has a dark shadow that has only grown larger over the last 80 years. Hidden among the rusted metal were pieces of technology that were decades ahead of their time. Messerschmitt Secrets Lost. When scientists finally opened the hatches of the U-864 wreck, they didn't just find poison, they found the remains of a desperate technological exchange. This mission, known as Operation Caesar, was a last-ditch effort to keep the war going by trading German engineering for Japanese resources. Inside the wreck, there are components for the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. These weren't just blueprints, they were actual engine parts and technical data that could have changed the air war in the Pacific. Imagine if Japan had been able to build a fleet of jet fighters in 1945. The entire history of the world might look different. But the British torpedoes ensured those parts never reached their destination. The cargo also included infrared fuses and other advanced electronics that were hands down the most sophisticated tech of the era. The Germans were leading the world in rocket science and jet propulsion, and they were willing to give it all away for a few more months of survival. The wreck is essentially a time capsule of 1945 technology. However, the salt water hasn't been kind to these engineering marvels. When the ROV scanned the interior, they found that much of the aluminum and light alloy parts had dissolved into a white crust. Only the heavy steel and brass components remain recognizable. It is a graveyard of what-ifs that scientists are now trying to document before they disappear forever. What most people don't realize is that this sub was basically a giant moving laboratory. It was a Type IXD-2, one of the largest submarines the Germans ever built, specifically designed for these long-distance transport missions. It had to carry enough fuel and supplies to travel halfway around the world without surfacing. But even with all that space, every inch was packed with cargo. The mercury was stored in the keel to help with stability, acting as ballast while it was being transported. This is why the mercury is so hard to get to now. It is at the very bottom of the wreck, covered by layers of rusted steel and collapsed decks. The crazy part is that the very thing that kept the sub stable in the water is now the thing that is destroying the environment. So, here's the deal. The technical secrets are fascinating, but they are also a distraction from the real issue. While historians want to see the jet parts, the environmentalists are screaming about the mercury. The 2026 plan to revisit the wreck involves a careful balance between preserving history and preventing a disaster. They want to retrieve as much of the high-tech cargo as they can, but the risk of breaking more mercury flasks is always there. It's not that simple, though, because the wreck is considered a war grave. 73 men died on that ship, and there are strict rules about disturbing their final resting place. Scientists have to be incredibly careful as they move through the broken hull. Every time they touch a piece of metal, they risk releasing a cloud of toxic silt. While the jet engines represent the past, the leaking mercury represents a very dangerous future. Future of Fedje wreck. The most recent data from the 2025 and 26 monitoring missions shows that the toxic zone is expanding. Scientists finally opened a new series of test wells in the sediment, and what they found is worse than reported in earlier studies. The mercury is slowly turning into methylmercury, which is the form that actually enters the food chain. This is the real danger. While metallic mercury is heavy and tends to sink, methylmercury is absorbed by small organisms which are then eaten by bigger fish. Eventually, that poison makes its way to the plates of people living in Norway and beyond. This is why there is a massive fishing ban in the miles surrounding the wreck. You can't even drop an anchor there because the risk of stirring up the poison is too high. Basically, the Norwegian government has been trying to figure out what to do for 20 years. For a long time, the plan was to bury the wreck. In 2016 and 2018, they actually covered the bow section with 30,000 square meters of sand and rock. This was supposed to stabilize the wreck and keep the mercury from moving. It was like putting a giant bandage on a deep wound. But here's the catch. The stern section is still exposed. It is decaying at a much faster rate than the part that was covered. And because the sub is sitting on a slope, there is a constant fear that the whole thing could slide. If the seabed shifts, that massive pile of rock and sand could actually crush the hull and pop the mercury flasks like bubbles. Is the risk of moving the mercury worth the potential disaster? Or should we leave the grave alone? Tell us what you think in the comments. Please like and subscribe for more mysteries.